All right, there we go. So now that we've talked about the exam and some questions, let's jump into today's actual content. The first thing we'll talk about is this group presentation. So if you look at your schedule, you'll see here that we're going to be selecting groups and topics for our group project. And we will have some time throughout the class to work on this group project. So if you look down here, groups for 30 minutes, essentially on that day, we'll end class 30 minutes early and allow you time to jump into group rooms here on Microsoft Teams. You can also use like Google Hangouts or Skype or whatever else you choose. But basically, we'll leave time to work in groups on October 6th. We'll leave time to work in groups on November 3rd. And I think one more time. Maybe I just missed one. I thought I had 3 in here in the syllabus, but I don't see all 3 here. So maybe I just forgot to put it on this final draft. If so, I'll update the schedule. But we will have some time to work on it in class, but most of the time for this project will be spent out of class. Essentially, what you'll be doing, I'll show you an example of the group presentations. Essentially, what you and your group will be doing is deciding on a topic that's of interest to everybody in the group, and then you'll be creating essentially a PowerPoint presentation on that topic. When it's an in-person class, you actually present it in front of the class. You have about 10 minutes to present it. When it's a fully online class like this, we make the PowerPoint and you make essentially a script or notes on what you would say or members of your group would say if you were to present it. So this is an assignment to essentially get you to work with groups as one and get a little better with that. Present information, factual information in maybe a more clear or interesting way to engage people. It's also a way to help show your knowledge in a subject and dive into something that's of interest to you. So a lot of the skills that you'll build or polish or get better at with this kind of project will be useful in essentially any industry that you go into. So no matter what kind of position that you go into, whether it's psychology or any other field, you will probably at some point be presenting some information to someone, whether it's a boss that you're proposing some change in this company with, if you're presenting some of your work to someone as a job interview, if you have a team that you've created something together and you're presenting it to, say, a client. There's a lot of different ways that you might be presenting information. So this assignment kind of tries to get at those skills and helps you improve them. And in this context, we're presenting it in a fully digital online format. If you want, you and your group, no one's done this yet in the fully online format, you and your group could do a recorded team meeting where you present it similar to how I'm presenting things now and essentially just post that on YouTube. Like make a video of you presenting it remotely. You don't have to be in the same room or anything. Or you can do just the PowerPoint presentation with the notes, and that's all that's required. So this is an example presentation. In Chapter 11, there's a couple topics actually that you can choose from. One of those is pro-social behavior and altruism, which is one of my favorites, so probably why I picked this. But this is actually just a slightly modified one that a student from 2 semesters, well, a group of students presented a couple semesters ago. So you can see here, this is the first page of the slide presentation, and down here is the notes that they would be using on that page. So when you're creating a presentation, you can often put notes, say if it's PowerPoint, Google Slides, anything like that, you can include notes on your slide. So when you're presenting in, say, a classroom setting or a business setting or something, you can see your notes and they can see your slides. So the notes are important so that you know essentially what to talk about. And this, again, is just kind of an example of a fairly good presentation. It's not perfect, but just to give you an idea. So here they are introducing themselves. Essentially there I'm saying, hey, this is just an example. It's not perfect. So they've got pro-social behavior defined here. They have a slide. It's really good contrast. You can read the words. It's not overlapping. It's big enough that you could see it on a small screen or a big screen. They've got the content in there. These notes are a bullet point note example. Essentially, these people would, during the course of the presentation, read the definition, give an example of prosocial behavior. They have a couple there to remind themselves, and then move on to the slides from the next page. The next page gives a couple other examples of prosocial behavior. Here you've got some relevant images that are relevant to the examples, and this is essentially an example of a script that you might put on this. So person one, reminder, and this is exactly what this person would say were they presenting this. This is a reminder, prosocial behaviors can benefit the actor. Some clear examples of prosocial behavior are donating money to charity, so on and so forth. So essentially, you'll create a presentation about a topic that's of interest to you in psychology, one that's covered in the textbook. So this one is on prosocial behavior. I'll skim through some of these other pages as well to give you some ideas. And this example document is on Canvas. I almost said Qualtrics, but that's not it. So this one, for example, has relevant image talking about prosocial behavior in non-human animals. So rats demonstrate prosocial behavior. You've got some bullet points to talk about, those kinds of things. And then a final page with references. So essentially, this is the final product of your group that you'll come to. So let's look at the topics that we are going to cover. Again, this topics document, this is on Canvas as well. It might open someday. Maybe we'll just open it through Canvas instead. Is it already? Oh, it's already open. That's why it's mad at me. All right, here are the topics that we can sign up for. So chapter 11, this is in order of when we cover them in class. So chapter 11, we have social psych experiments. Chapter 11, we also have altruism and prosocial behavior. Chapter 10, personality assessment. So if you have ever taken a personality assessment or thought that sounds like a really interesting thing, maybe that's a group to join. Operant conditioning. This is like training. If you've ever trained a dog using reinforcement or punishment, that's what we're talking about there, operant conditioning. Memory tips for life. This is essentially cognitive psych research about the memory that you can use in day-to-day life to do better with studying, to do better with remembering your shopping list, things like that. Cognitive behavioral therapy. A lot of students are really interested in the chapters 12 and 13. Chapter 12 focuses a lot on different disorders, and then chapter 13 focuses a lot on treatment for these disorders. So I try to put it all in this for this group. You don't have to talk about only cognitive behavioral therapy. You can talk about additional kinds of therapies. You can talk about what therapies are best for this specific disorder, but because people are interested in different disorders, it might be best to talk about, go over only like 2, maybe 3 disorders, and then talk about treatments to those. But again, that's up for that group to decide how broad or how narrow they want to focus. Definitely don't want to give themselves too much work and make their presentation a lot longer than the one that I just showed you. Motivation, I'm skipped over chapter 9. There's a couple different topics. Self-determination theory is one specific theory that's really relevant today on how and why people act and do things. So it is a motivation theory, but it's a more modern one. Other motivation theories can be talked about. And then happiness and positive psychology is another topic that students are sometimes interested. So if there are other topics, if you look at those and you're like, I don't really think I like one, maybe put up in the chat something else that you're interested in. Maybe other people can join you. What we want to have is small groups of about 4 to 5 students working on these presentations. It can be 3, but I really don't want it to be much bigger than 5. So that you can work together, everybody can have enough to do, that they're learning and they are working, so there's not a, say, 6th person who just doesn't do anything and everybody else pulls the weight. So three can make it pretty difficult, but as that is possible, so 4 or 5 is kind of what I'm shooting for. These are the topics, so keep that in mind. I'll jump in the slides. Essentially these, yeah. So read your syllabus for more detail. So groups of 4 or 5 students, select a topic in class, we'll create the presentation. You can use videos as part of your, like in your slides, like a link to a YouTube video, but try not to, or try to keep those under 3 minutes, especially when presenting in the classroom itself. That takes a lot of time. It's not as big of a problem here in this context, but make sure that the videos aren't too long. So we will have time to work together in class, but most of the work for this project will be done throughout the semester outside of class. So as we're thinking about groups, as you're thinking about those different topics, figure out people's schedules. If there's a couple groups, if let's say there are 7 people interested in talking about positive psychology and happiness, and 3 of them can work at one time, and what did I say? 4 of them can work at another time and can meet consistently, then we could split that into 2 different groups doing the same kind of thing. You'll want to get phone numbers, emails of each other. You can use this Microsoft Teams to meet in. I will probably, once Teams gets solidified, I will actually probably make new groups where you can come and meet, that only your group is invited to, so you can work there if you want to as well. Or you can also use Dropbox, Google Slides. Google Slides is a good one because everybody can be working on it at the same time, and it's automatically saving all the changes at the same time. So that is the assignment. That's what you'll be doing. We'll go over some rules for making good presentations, but hopefully that gives you a better description of what the assignment is. Here are those topics again. Are there questions on what this assignment is, what your expectations are? I see Lindsay's hand is up, but I think that's just still up from earlier. We will be picking in just a moment. So, or do a first set of picking.
Yeah, sorry, it's just up from earlier.
No problem. But yeah, we will start picking topics in just a minute. So what I would expect from you students today, oh, good question. This won't be the exact same groups that you've been in for the weekly discussions. In those future weekly discussions, I might actually have you go into these new groups that you're going to select today. But if you have worked with that group during the weekly meetings and you like those people, you think they'd be trustworthy to be in your group, feel free to make that your group as well. So it's pretty open and free right now of who can and cannot be in your group. The only limitation is that about 4 or 5 students per group. All right, so basically my expectation is in a minute I will say who's interested in social psych experiments, and anybody who is, just put a little thing in the chat box that says social psych experiments. So we have that record essentially with the meeting chat, and then people can get in contact with you, things like that. So in a minute I will do that. So just look at these topics, think about what you might be interested in, think maybe back to that first week that we met, the interest that you had in psychology, which of those fit closest. Oh, one thing I did not mention, here it has the pages in the text on these topics. So when we're thinking about social psych experiments, you're like, okay, well, yeah, that's interesting, but where in the world is that? Where do I start? So today, what I would expect you to do is tell the class which topic you're interested in, basically which group that you'd be interested in joining, and then start meeting with that group. So we'll break off in for a little bit so you can get phone numbers, things like that, emails, whatever you need to contact each other. You could even actually maybe just write down people's names and then email. So since this is recording, I'm going to put it on YouTube. I don't want everybody's emails and phone numbers floating around YouTube. So let's write down each other's names instead. And then get in contact after this class. Where was I going with that? Then the next thing your group should do is go to these pages in the textbook. So let's say, okay, social psych experiments starts on page 423. So I'm actually going to pull up the textbook right now. And go to page 423. All right, I'm pretty close actually. All right, so for the first group doing social psych experiments, that content is between pages 423 and 427. So coming back here to the textbook, 423, it starts talking about social psych topics, which we'll be covering within this first unit, or first unit, this second unit. This will be the last chapter in this unit. So it talks about conformity, Ash's conformity experiment, talks about Milgram's experiment with shocking people. I think we mentioned that the Stanford prison study. It's not actually an experiment. It's more of a simulation. It's just one of those like methods things that a pet peeve. It's like, it's not actually an experiment. Stop calling it an experiment. Just a pet peeve of mine though. And then to 427. So here it does talk about one last study or one last example relevant to it. But you can find other social psych studies too that are really interesting that you might want to talk about. So this would be a place to start. Then your group would come and read these pages in the text, maybe set a deadline, be like, all right, by next Friday, we're all going to meet and we all have to have those pages read in the text. So everybody comes to that meeting, everybody's read that, and then you can talk about, okay, what did you think was the most interesting? Someone might be like, well, I really thought Ash's experiment was interesting. Someone might be like, I liked Milgram's. Someone else might say, well, I liked another study that I learned about in social psych in high school, or I heard about it on the news. So you could even talk about that one too. So you can focus only on the content in the chapter if you like for your presentation, or you can focus on the topic more broadly. So this talks about social psych experiments. You could bring in your own. You could say, all right, so there's a lot of other social psych experiments. One that's pretty interesting is the Rattlers and the Eagles. If that's something that you're interested in, that was a really good study that showed examples of what different groups will do when put in competition with each other, as well as maybe how to get rid of some of the animosity between groups. Has some really relevant findings for, say, racism and getting rid of racism. So that's, again, the Rattlers and the Eagles experiment. There's a lot of other social psych studies. So as you look at the topics and as you look at those page numbers, so choose a topic, get with your group, then start reading that material in the chapter, and then decide, do we want to focus our presentation just on the material in the chapter, or do we want to focus our presentation on this specific aspect of the chapter? Maybe positive reinforcement is the most interesting to you, and so your entire presentation for operant conditioning is on positive reinforcement. Still is about that same length, but is only focused on that one topic. That kind of thing. The memory tips for life, it gives quite a few tips, but it really goes over them very briefly. So if you wanted to dive into a lot of depth on 2 or 3 of those, that would be really useful. Or if you wanted to cover as many memory tips as you could in a short amount of time, that'd be great too. So there is a lot of freedom with this. It'll require working with your group, setting assignments for each other, holding each other accountable as you're doing the work, and then in the end, the final product will be this presentation that you all turn in through Canvas. So everybody in the group will turn in both the final presentation, which would look something like this, your slides with your notes, or the presentation itself. Maybe just a link to the Google Slides would work for me as well, as long as it's publicly available. So you'll turn in that. So every single person in the group will turn in the slides, and every single person in the group will also turn in a rating of other members of the group. So I will show you that right now too. Group member rating, that's it. Lots of things to open and show today. All right, so this is the document. This is already on Canvas. So essentially you will put your name here. So this is Ryan Riches. And my contributions were 4 out of 5, communication and listening. I'll rate myself as 3 out of 5, cooperation 5 out of 5, and preparation 4 out of 5. To get more detail on what those all mean, contributions, you might rate a 5 if they always contribute. The quality of that contribution is exceptional. Oh, my formatting here is bad. Cooperation and openness to others' ideas. If they're listening to others' ideas without interrupting, you might give them a 5. If they're never showing up, you might give them a 0. So you will rate every single member of your group. So member 2, but you'll actually put their name. So maybe this one is Joe. This one is Ellen. This one is Jordan. This one is Ariel. So just as an example, and then you'll rate each of those group members just by highlighting this and then turning that in. If you wanted to, you can also put in some open-ended comments. So the thing that everybody turns in is, 1, your presentation itself, whether it's in PDF, PowerPoint format, .odp, what's that file type, or a Google Slides link. So that will be what you actually turn in, is the presentation and the rating of the other students. All right, I think that answers all the questions that I didn't think to talk about the first time I started going through this spiel. So, any questions, or are we ready to start seeing who's interested in what groups? If you're interested in more than one group, that's all right too. So you can say, I'm interested in memory tips for life as well as social psych experiments. But I'm basically going to go in order. Who's interested in social psych? Give about 30 seconds for anybody to type in, I'm interested in social psych, or something like that. So feel free to start writing your comment of, I'm interested in self-determination theory, and then wait till I say that, and then you can press enter when I say that. All right, so any questions? I don't see any hands or any comments jumping up. Looks like a couple students might have got booted from the meeting. So I'm going to re-invite them here. Jada, go for it. You've got a question?
Yeah, so when you read off the list, can you do like a brief summary of what that exactly is? Okay.
Yep, I can definitely do that. Maybe I'll just go through that brief summary of what they are right now before we go through the list. So you already have an idea of, oh, does that sound interesting or not? So social psych experiments. In social psychology, there's been a lot of experiments done that were really unethical. So some of them were kind of interesting or unusual or strange. So that one a lot of students find interesting. There are more modern social psych experiments that are more ethical, that are actually really quite good, that we can learn a lot from. So it's a really broad area. If you're interested in experiments about groups or individuals and groups, or social psych is about how people interact with other people pretty broadly. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Altruism and pro-social behavior is probably my favorite topic on this list, which is probably why it's in there. Doesn't mean you'll get a better score. I'll actually probably be a little more critical of yours, not to like scare you away from doing it, but I'm always available to help with any of these topics as your group is going through things. So feel free to contact me and be like, hey, we're confused. We don't know where to go. Can you give us some pointers, additional studies, things like that. So altruism, well, let's start with pro-social behavior. Pro-social behavior is essentially the simple act of helping other people. So whether it be volunteering, whether it be giving a homeless person some money, something like that. Altruism is like pro-social behavior elevated. So pro-social behavior can benefit the actor. Like if I do something good, I might do that good thing in expectation of getting something back. Altruism is a pro-social behavior that you have no expectation of reward at all. It's something done good out of the goodness of your heart. Essentially, you could, I mean, I feel terrible about myself having said that because that wasn't a very good research or description, but a good kind of general description that will give you an idea of what you're looking at there. So you can talk about altruism and pro-social behavior in humans, altruism and pro-social behavior in animals, how evolution is related to altruism and pro-social behavior. I mean, there's a lot to do there, but hopefully that gives you some idea how to be helpful or learning about being helpful to other people. Personality assessment. So if you've ever done one of those funny quizzes like which Harry Potter character are you, that kind of thing, that's a kind of personality assessment, right? There are actually valid personality assessments. There's also invalid ones. A lot of the ones that you've probably heard of are the ones that aren't very good. So what's it called? The Myers-Briggs. You might have done the Myers-Briggs personality test, and it's not actually a valid test. It's not a good test of personality. That might be hard to hear. Some people, especially in certain industries, in business, really rely on the Myers-Briggs to kind of create teams and like put people in groups that they'll work together with. It's an example of trying to get at people's characteristics and describe them in some broad way. Current personality assessments look at big 5 characteristics. So openness to experience, conscientiousness. There's only 5, but they literally just left me. The big 5, if you search that, that's another personality test that's actually valid today. But assessments like that, so you could talk about good ones, talk about bad ones. The book talks about like the Rorschach ink blot test. So if that one, like the picture is like, what do you see in this picture of the ink blot? If that sounds interesting to you. Operant conditioning, so chapter 5, this one. Operant conditioning is essentially positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. And so you might not have ever heard any of those terms except for punishment and reinforcement. So essentially you can use these different techniques, punishment, reinforcement, positive or negative, to try and train behaviors in people. It's a behaviorism technique or behavioral technique. It's also really related to applied behavioral analysis as well. A lot of ABA therapists working with young people will use a lot of operant conditioning to train different behaviors or reduce certain behaviors. Like if a child has a symptom of biting, you might use operant conditioning to reduce that behavior by giving them reinforcements when they don't do it or something like that. So if you've ever trained a dog to do things, you've probably used operant conditioning. So operant conditioning can be used in animals, humans. Yeah, so that's about what that is. Memory tips for life. I think I mentioned this one earlier. Essentially, it's a section in the book at the end of our chapter on memory that gives a lot of good tips for how can you use what you've learned in this chapter in your day-to-day life. How can you use the knowledge of how we encode memories to do a better job on exams or in remembering your shopping list or in remembering people's names. So if that's of interest to you to learn, that could be really good. It's got a whole bunch of different tips all around memory. So if you've struggled with your memory or you think memory might be really fascinating, maybe you like the core memories from, what's that movie? Goodness. Is it Inside Out? the one with the little glowy emotions and the little memory balls?
Yes.
I got a yes from students as well as my wife who was overhearing me. So that was kind of funny. I had some surround sound going. Even if that's of interest to you, you can learn about memory and how to help people do better with their memory. If you've got children that you want to help improve their memory, it might be a good topic too. Cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most common or most popular right now therapies that exist. It's pretty wide ranging in the different kind of treatments that it can be effective with. So depression, anxiety, personality disorders, a lot of different things, marriage and family issues. A lot of different therapists will use cognitive behavioral therapy. Again, if you don't want to focus on cognitive behavioral therapy exclusively, if you want to focus on a couple specific disorders from chapter 12 or 13, that's kind of a placeholder for disorders and therapies. So with that, there are so many different topics there that students might want to talk about. So it might be hard to like narrow down if one student really wants to talk about anxiety, one student really wants to talk about, say, borderline personality disorder. Obviously, those are different enough that you might not be able to make a whole presentation that flows well talking about those diverse topics, but you might as well. So that'll be something that your group needs to decide. But cognitive behavioral therapy uses essentially the knowledge of how our mind works, how memories are formed, how we take in information, how we process information, how we understand language. So essentially how our cognition works, as well as that behaviorism, that operant conditioning, how we get reinforced, how we get punished, how that affects how we think, how that affects how we behave, and kind of tries to teach people new techniques of ways to process and interpret and take in information so that maybe their triggers aren't so triggering anymore, for example. So something that makes them feel really anxious, like knowing that an exam is coming up. So they can now process that differently. A cognitive behavioral therapist would give them new techniques so that they can learn how to process that differently. So now they don't have an anxiety attack. Now they might still feel a little anxious, but it's not nearly as bad as an attack. So quick description of cognitive behavioral therapy. Self-determination theory is one that focuses on how we decide, like what we'll do. I think actually there's a nice little, I think I have actually a nice little diagram to explain self-determination theory. But it is a theory of motivation, essentially of one that focuses on why people do what they do. Yeah, that's the one I was thinking of. Perfect. That was quick. And it's a little small, but hopefully this is helpful. So essentially, the idea is that relatedness with other people, your own personal autonomy, what you are capable of yourself, and your competence in any given area will be related to what you yourself determines to do, like what you will be motivated to do. So DC and Ryan talked about this. Maybe look up, I mean, right now you can't, but if you think that might be interesting, that specific theory of motivation, maybe look up a quick YouTube video. They're pretty recent researchers, so they're still actively researching this now, so you might find some good stuff there. It's a useful new one. Motivation theories is kind of like a lot of different theories. Maybe I'll just skim through the pages in the book that cover that. So 326, where did the book go? Sorry, this description of each of these is a lot longer than I was planning on, but hopefully this is helpful. So this is where it starts in the books. So evolutionary approach, like how is instinct related to what we do? Drive reduction theory is another specific motivation theory. Optimal arousal theory. So there's, and then the chapter gets into hunger and sex and how those are motivated. So you could talk about that. I'm thinking of like these older theories of motivation as the ones to focus on. But if you wanted to talk about the biology of hunger or the biology of sex and how that leads to things like, for example, obesity, one of the motivators for us to eat sweet things and fatty things is because of evolution, essentially. So we can pack those calories in because we might not be able to have them when we're hunting gathering kind of thing, as an example. So that is motivation theories. It's kind of broad for that whole chapter. And then happiness is essentially positive psychology. What does psychology know about how to make you happy, or how you can be happy, how to have more positive experiences, things like that. So it's a shorter section of the chapter, but there is a lot of material that I can provide to you as well on, say, positive psychology. So 358, it's really close to where we just were. Just scroll down to that. So here we go, biological factors, obstacles to happiness, goal striving, and then I have a bunch of material on positive psychology. Here, I'll actually just search for a little image of pillars of positive psychology. So positive psychology is essentially made up of, well, this is one model, the PERMA model, looking at things like positive emotions, engagement in the world. So are you engaged in your work? Do you have hobbies that you're really engaged with? Relationships. So do you have good, strong relationships? How to make good, strong relationships? Meaning, how can you find meaning? What things can you find meaning in? And achievement. So that's goals, achieving those goals, those kinds of things. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea about what each of these topics cover, so that you can have some idea of what you might want to join a group to do. So any questions on those before I start spouting off who's interested in this group? Any more details you want about any of those? All right, I don't see any hands and there's no chat boxes appearing. So let's go through and start with the topics you might be interested in. All right, so it looks like Christopher is interested in social psych experiments. So who else is interested in social psych experiments? So wait till I say the ones so don't just right now jump in and say I'm interested in happiness. So anyone interested in social psych, put that up here. If you're interested in something else too, feel free to put that in, but only when it's one of the topics that I call on. So social psych experiments, it looks like we've got Christopher, Destiny, Don Mira. All right, Don Grover says, hopefully everybody's got the chat box open so you can see this. Don says operant conditioning, self-determination, and motivation. So any of those groups, so that's fine. So for social psych experiment, it looks like we've got Christopher, Destiny, and Don Mira. So get together so that you can work in that group. 3 is a little small, but there might be students who aren't here today, or there might be students who jump in. So I think 3 would be fine. There's plenty of information for social psych experiments, so I don't think it would be difficult for a group of 3 to do that. All right, so for chapter 11, altruism and pro-social behavior, who would be interested in that topic? All right, so Des is interested in altruism and pro-social behavior, as well as personality assessments and memory tips for life and motivation theories. All right, so anyone else interested in altruism, pro-social behavior? Just Des and I, that's all right. No, it's fine. If you're not interested in altruism, pro-social behavior, I'll change your mind by the end of the class. That's my goal now. All right, so anybody else interested in personality assessment, chapter 10? So Des mentioned they were interested in personality assessment, and yeah. So anyone else interested in personality assessment? All right, we've got okay, great. Now we have a couple people interested in personality assessment. So Don Mira, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing any of these wrong, is also interested in personality assessment and also mentioned social psych experiments. And then Lindsay Mathis is interested in personality assessment as well as cognitive behavioral therapy. And then Carter Whalen is interested in personality assessment, and then also memory trips for life and cognitive behavioral therapy. All right. All right, so hopefully that gives you a couple people to contact about personality assessment. And now operant conditioning. Who's interested in operant conditioning? And feel free to put your post again, even if you put it already, that you're interested in operant conditioning. So Don Grover, for example, that looked like it was your top interest. So we've got Don Grover was interested in operant conditioning, Destiny Duran, Daisy, and Flavia, sorry about mispronouncing names. I think I've only heard your names the one time when you introduced yourself, so I'm sorry about that. All right, so that would be a good group of, looks like 4 there for operant conditioning. That would be perfect. So write down each other's names for any of these groups. Write down each other's names, send an email. You can just send an email to anyone in the class through Canvas. Maybe I'll show how to do that really quick. If I've got Canvas open, I should usually have my inbox open. So to compose a message, go up here, and then you can select the course that you want to send a message to. Ours is 351, and then say to all in that group. No, actually, sorry, don't say that. Don't say anybody. Let's say just start typing in a name. So Brian Riches, it's my name. I want to send an email to myself and say, hey, do you want to join my group? And send an email to those students that you see are interested in the same topic that you are. All right, let's go back to the topics. We just found 4 people interested in operant conditioning. Memory tips for life. So again, if you've already mentioned it, like Carter Whalen mentioned memory tips for life earlier. All right, so we've got also Catherine Keller, Nicholas Eng, and oh, it's moving. Tiara. All right, so that would be a good group. It looks like about 5 people there. Oh, Des as well was interested in memory tips. So since there weren't other people that were interested in your first couple interests, Des, you might want to jump in to this group. And then that might be 6 people, but we'll see. We'll see who ends up being here versus other groups that they're interested in. 6 would be definitely the max I would want in a group, though. I'd prefer 5, but if it's 6, that's okay. All right, so who is interested in cognitive behavioral therapy? As well as that, again, chapter 12 is on disorders, and chapter 13 is on treatments. So if you're interested in disorders as well, this kind of fits here. So Lauren Pierce, Miriam. All right, so, and if there's anybody interested in any other specific disorders, feel free to chime in here too. And then with that group, you could decide, well, how are you going to fit that topic into the presentation? All right, so we've got Lauren, Miriam, and Asher are interested in cognitive behavioral therapy. Great. And then let's jump to, Jada Martinez as well is also interested in cognitive behavioral therapy. So for some of you, you're interested in 2, even 3 topics. You can decide as you communicate with the groups back and forth. I would say just everybody who's here in class, just try to be the first one to contact people. So if you send an email and someone else sends an email immediately after, that's totally fine. You can't over email about making these groups. So, all right, so Lindsay Mathis, Jada Martinez, Asher, Miriam, and Lauren all interested in cognitive behavioral therapy. All right, great. So self-determination theory, that's chapter 9. It's one of the more modern motivation theories. A lot about, like, I didn't mention this, a lot about like human agency and what you choose to do, a lot about how other contextual factors affect what you choose to do. So Richard will do any of the last 3, so that's self-determination theory, motivation theories, or happiness. In the past, students who did chapter 11 actually had to get it done really quickly because we had them present during that chapter. Now everybody's presentation is due at the same time when it's a fully online format like this. So choosing one of the last 3 or one of the first 3, all of them are due at the same time. I don't think I even said the due date earlier, but it is in the schedule. The group presentations are all due essentially the Saturday after we're back from our Thanksgiving break. All right, so let's go motivation theories. Anyone specifically interested in motivation theories? Des is. So Parker Schaefer, motivation theories. Alejandro, motivation theories as well. Great, so that would be 3. That's a little small of a group, but there are a lot of motivation theories. You can even talk about self-determination theory as one of them as well. So so Richard could jump in to this group and talk about self-determination theories as well as other motivation theories. And then some of you are also interested in happiness. So if you wanted to do just more of a chapter 9 presentation in general, it does take a while to find groups. Even in an in-person class setting, I'll stand there in front of the class and say, hey, who's interested in this topic? And have students move over to a specific spot in a classroom and try to talk to each other. And then it always turns out that the next week I have to come back and be like, hey, who is interested in these? Let's move to the different spots in the rooms because people didn't actually get emails. People weren't sure which ones they wanted to be in. They were still a little confused about aspects of the groups. So if in 4 days from now you still don't have a group, that's okay. We have time to work on this. It's not due next week. It's due near the end of the semester. So you will have time. We'll have time to work on it in class. As we start the next class period, I will probably be like, hey, who has not found a group or who has not been in contact with their group? So we spend a lot of time getting into the groups, but that's just kind of the nature of group work in this setting. So, but yeah, it will take a little bit of time. All right, so happiness, people are jumping ahead of me and saying, hey, I want to do happiness. Let's stop talking about this. So we've got Christopher interested in happiness, Asher and Alejandro interested in happiness. So hopefully you've written down 1 or 2 topics that are of interest to you and a couple people who are also interested in that. If you don't remember, I'm hoping, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think the meeting chat is recorded as I post the lecture online. So feel free to jump in and talk to these different people. Jada Martinez also thinks happiness sounds like a great plan, which is kind of a funny sentence to say. But hopefully you've got a couple different people to talk to. I will definitely save this whole chat at the end of this meeting so that I can see who is interested in what too, even if it doesn't record properly for the future. So even right now, if you wanted to take a couple minutes to scroll back through the chat, look at the people, and then start writing an email or something like that, or put a list of who you should be contacting, let's do that right now. Let's have a little break where you can do that. We'll come back at 8:30 and jump into chapter 4 material. Also, while we're on this break doing that, feel free to write down any questions in the chat box. Yeah, start writing down who you should be getting in contact with, even write an email if you're quick enough to do that. And we'll come back and do some course content on chapter 4 at 8:30. we'll give people a couple more seconds to get back here before we jump into chapter 4. But Dawn, if you had a question, feel free to talk over the audio chat. My earpiece is in now, or feel free to type it as well.
I apologize. I was just having a moment because it was quiet. And then I realized that we were supposed to be looking through and seeing who was interested in the same topics that we were and who we needed to contact. It was my fault. I apologize.
Yeah, no problem. So hopefully you did have a chance. Hopefully everybody had a chance to do that over the last couple minutes. And so maybe even sent some emails to potential group members so that we can get those groups set out. All right, as you did that, are there any other questions that came to your mind as you were thinking about this group project? Feel free to raise your hand or type the question in as well. All right, well, I realized over the break that I didn't go over examples of bad and good PowerPoints. So with the time that it is, I'd rather jump straight into chapter 4 than go through that. The beginning of the slides for this unit. Oh, good question. So Christopher, if you are the only person in a group, you could wait a week or so to see if other people contact you or are interested in that, or just choose a different group that you might be interested in and try to jump in on that topic. So it's up to you if you want to wait a week and see if anybody else contacts you that's interested, that you didn't realize was, because there are some students who aren't here today. They might be interested in that topic as well. So you could wait a little bit or jump in on another group. Very, very rarely do I have single person groups, just because the assignment ends up being so different. And one of the big things with it is that I want students to get practice with is working in a group. So it is possible, but the only times I've done that are when a student had, for example, a medical emergency that they ended up having to go and get surgery, and they wouldn't be making it 2 class periods anymore. So hopefully you can be with the group. If not, email me and we can talk about it. All right, so near the beginning of the slides for this unit, we've got some different slides that will kind of give you some tips and pointers on how to make a good presentation, how to do a good PowerPoint presentation, and especially how to make them accessible. So there might be some other people. Jada just sent an email to Christopher about the happiness topic. So if that's something that you'd want, hopefully we can get these. Oh, okay, perfect. All right, so in this presentation at the beginning, I'm not going to go over it in detail. I'd actually like you to skim over it yourself. Maybe next class period, I'll go through it in more detail, but it gives tips for how to make good accessible PowerPoints, like having text without tails in a presentation format like this. It gives some examples of text that will work, some color combinations that can work, size recommendations for size of text on different pages. So colors and backgrounds should have high contrast, color gradients to use. So don't use gray. It makes it hard. Make sure that your background and your text are contrasting. So go through these and look at some examples of text and colors that contrast. You can also take this presentation and use it as a template, like use these backgrounds if you want, or create your own. So feel free to go through those. I might go through it in more detail before next class, and this bad PowerPoint that I mentioned here, because it's pretty bad. No problem, Christopher. Yeah, I thought originally that maybe you were saying you were wanting to do a solo project versus just wondering what would happen. So that was a good question. Either way, it was a good question. So students know in general, as well as if that was something that you were thinking of doing. All right, so let's jump into chapter 4. I feel like we've been in this class half of the period and we haven't jumped into much psych content. Lots of logistics to get these groups up and running. But that's just the way it is. All right, so let's talk about consciousness. We'll get to I'm laughing at the sentence I was about to say, and I didn't even say it yet. So I was going to say, let's talk about consciousness, then we'll get to sleep, and then we'll talk about drugs. So hopefully we can talk about consciousness, sleep, and drugs before we all end this class and then go to sleep. And look, caffeine, drugs as well during the class, so fun. Caffeine is, spoiler alert, is the most commonly used drug worldwide. So it's in a class called stimulants. So, but we'll get to that. Let's talk about consciousness to begin with. So, conscious awareness. So essentially that thing that you are experiencing yourself, your mind as you're thinking about things, you're coming up with creative ideas, you're planning out things to do, is the things that we're aware of in our immediate environment, the things we have access to right now, the memories that are being brought up, the things we're thinking about in the future, the past. All of that is essentially our conscious awareness. It's where we imagine, it's where we feel pain, where we feel love, where we have experiences. Another way that we'll refer to this in the future when we're talking about cognitive psychology is actually working memory. So working memory is essentially the place where you yourself kind of lives and is experiencing these things. So those things that you're conscious of, that's your consciousness. You can think of it, going back to that example of Inside Out I mentioned earlier, those emotions would sit at that table with the little buttons all over, and they had like their view of what the child Riley was seeing. So they were the conscious awareness in that movie. So kind of a funny example. So thinking about what we think is called metacognition. And so a lot of what we're talking about today is metacognition. We're going to be talking about how we think, how we experience what our conscious experience is made up of. So, speaking of Inside Out, a little image from Inside Out. So have you ever tried to follow your train of thought, or you're now thinking of something, maybe you got distracted, and then you think, oh, how did I get to this? Why am I thinking about this now? It's one thing that I've always found fascinating, even as a child, trying to piece back. Why am I thinking about this now? I started off thinking about Batman the Animated Series, and now I'm thinking about something completely different. To be honest, usually it ends with me thinking about Batman the Animated Series, but that's beside the point. Conscious awareness of our inner mind has really been a fairly recent study. For a long time, psychology was focused on a lot of behaviorism and focused only on those things that we can outwardly observe, like someone picks up a cup or someone acts in a certain way, things like that. More recent work has emphasized a lot more of the mental processes, especially since we know a lot more about neurons. So this image is kind of an artist rendering of a neuron and those neurotransmitters being sent between the neurons. So with that understanding of how the brain works, being able to map different parts of the brain, we can better understand how we are experiencing our consciousness. So consciousness is two pieces, awareness and arousal. So awareness is that awareness of self, awareness of our thoughts, being aware that those exist, being aware of those experiences. And then arousal in this context means a state of engagement with the environment. So if you look at sleep, for example, you're not going to be in a very high arousal state when you're asleep because you're not that engaged with the environment. If you're really, really focused on, say, a basketball game that you're playing, your arousal level will probably be a lot higher, right? So that's what it's talking about there. So consciousness is awareness and arousal. So the person who is sleeping is not conscious in the same way that someone who is awake is conscious. So we'll talk about some of those delineations. So this is related to the theory of mind, and the theory of mind is essentially the idea that people can understand that they think and perceive differently than someone else. So I perceive differently than you perceive differently than any other person in the class, in the chat boxes. So we all have different perspectives, perceptions. Behind my computer right now, I see a set of blinds, a lamp, my very messy desk, and you are not perceiving that because you can't see my messy desk, which is good, I think. With that, the theory of mind does seem to emerge between about the ages of 3 or 4. There are some theorists who think there might be a theory of mind mechanism, that we have essentially evolved a part of our brain or connections within our brain, or the capacity that at about that age, our brain connects up to a point where we suddenly realize other people are having different experiences than we are. I don't think we have time to watch this video, but it might be a good one to go to if you want to know a little bit more about the theory of mind and the development of that. So with that awareness, so remember, consciousness is awareness and arousal. Awareness isn't just an on-off switch. Awareness has different levels, so you can have higher levels of conscious awareness, lower levels of conscious awareness, altered states of conscious awareness, subconscious awareness, and then also no awareness, or having that awareness completely off. So some drugs or sleeping or being more focused might lead you to some higher, lower, or even altered states of consciousness. So when we're thinking of higher level states of consciousness, that's usually more controlled processes, things that you are focused on, goal-oriented things, selectively attending to certain things. We've talked about selective attention, planning, figuring out how to work, say, a new phone. A phone's actually a really good example for a lot of things we've talked about for neurology. So just the other day, I had an Android update on my phone, and now I have to attend to it a lot more because the old gestures that I was using aren't exactly the same anymore. So I have to have more higher level consciousness when using my phone now versus before. I could use a lower level consciousness. I didn't have to be as aware of what was going on. So with that, you need executive function. You're going to be using the prefrontal cortex for that, for a lot of these processes. Lower level consciousness are things that are a lot more automatic. You can't even, so more automatic processes all the way down to daydreaming. So while you're sitting here listening to me, watching the screen, your mind might trail off. You might even start to daydream. That would be considered lower level consciousness. My comment a little bit earlier about being able to do things on my phone without really thinking about them, those are pretty automatic processes. So for example, when I hear the text notification for my phone, I reach into my pocket pretty immediately, grab it, and check who the text was from, right? So that's a really automatic process. I don't have to consciously think about it. I don't have to be aware of it. Sometimes it just happens. Maybe you've been on a date and that happens. You just check your phone and your date gives you kind of a glare because you're now not focusing your attention there. They think maybe you're focusing your attention here. You can say, hey, I was just using lower level of conscious process. It was just automatic. I checked my phone. Probably don't actually try that. That doesn't sound like it would go over well. So a lot of driving your car, especially if you've been doing it for a long time, is probably pretty automatic. You probably know where the shifter is, where the clutch, or if those aren't part of your car, you know how to like get it into reverse, you know where the windshield wipers are, things like that. It was funny living in California. Anytime it rained, it was so rare that I did sometimes forget where the windshield wipers were on the car. So it was not an automatic process. I had to use a higher level of conscious processing to figure out, how do I work the windshield wipers again? So what is the neurology? We had chapter 2 on neurology. What is the neurology behind being able to do these kind of complex tasks like driving a car automatically? What is happening in your neurons to make that happen? feel free to raise your hand and then probably take over the speaking position and you can kind of explain what is happening. No ideas with how your neurons work, how your neurons actually do these automatic processes by themselves? Well, we didn't get, I think that was a day where I sent you a video about that I had lectured on neurons beforehand. So we didn't get to actually talk one-on-one about this before. But a lot of what the brain does and those neurons do is create patterns, create neural networks that kind of develop habits to do things. So that behavior of picking up and checking your phone, whether it's putting in your password or using where the fingerprint scanner is, turning volume up and down, using buttons, that task, or driving the car, putting it into gear, putting it in reverse, well, that's a gear, those processes become really automatic because our neurons, they know what to do, and the neurons will do them by themselves. So you hear that signal of a text notification, and your brain, by itself, those neurons in that process, your brain registers that sound that then activates those neural pathways, that whole network. So this neuron talks to this neuron, talks to this neuron, talks to this neuron, talks to this one, talks to these five, talks to these other five. And so that whole network will then send a message all by itself to pick up your phone and check that text. So that is what the neurons are doing. They form these habits, or as we form habits, it's really these neurons creating these networks because they are sending these messages so frequently. It's really easy for them to send those messages. It doesn't take a lot of focused energy or attention or awareness to make them do these things. So we'll just check our phone without realizing it, or be able to drive and turn and go through our daily commute without really thinking about it. All right, so daydreaming is between active consciousness but it's not quite asleep. So mind wandering is the most common form of daydreaming. So if you're sitting here listening and then your mind kind of trails off, you have a new train of thought doing something. That's an example of daydreaming. It's related to the default mode network, which is essentially the pre-programmed neural pathways that are kind of always running. You can think of it as the background processes that are always running on your computer or your phone. That default mode network is kind of the most commonly used neurons that are just kind of always running and doing things. That might be part of your default mode network, might be why a certain topic keeps coming to your mind all the time. Maybe you've been writing a book and your mind just all of a sudden, all the time just goes there. It might have become part of your default mode network. Yeah. So some other examples that come from the book, just in different images, it's kind of just as a study tool. Altered states of consciousness, we'll talk about that in the form of, say, like drugs or hypnosis even. Subconscious awareness, sleeping and dreaming, and then no awareness is being under anesthesia or being knocked out, that kind of thing. All right, so let's talk about altered states of consciousness. So this ranges from losing one's sense of self or self-consciousness all the way to completely hallucinating. So just having like a funny sense that you're kind of not all there, or you're kind of like out of body or something like that, all the way to intense hallucinations. So there's a whole range then of altered states of consciousness. So drugs can trigger these, whether it's illegal drugs or it's medicines. It can be triggered by drugs, can be triggered by trauma, fever even, fatigue, sensory deprivation. They might all trigger an altered state of consciousness, as well as hypnosis. So any of these topics that we hit on, for example, hypnosis, we'll talk about a little bit today, but we're not going to dive into in too much depth. If it's something you're interested in and you'd like to know more about, that could be a good topic for, say, a question paper. Maybe put down your idea and wait till you get your grades on the first one to start writing your second one. But basically at this point, you can write that second question paper at any time in between now and exam 2. So another level of awareness is subconscious awareness. And so there are a lot of mental processes that are happening without our conscious awareness at all, so that we're not quite aware of or that they are not aware of at all. So you might be thinking about a solution to a problem and then something just kind of pops into your head. Well, your brain might have still been working on that, even though now you're on, say, a new task, doing something different. Your brain might still be processing things through those neural networks that you're just not consciously aware of, and then all of a sudden, your brain by itself brings something to your conscious awareness. Also, let's say an example, there's a dog running down the street. With your unconscious mind, you might say it's a black dog moving fast before it becomes consciously aware, you're consciously aware of it. Like you might only be aware that it's a dog running down the street. The rest of your brain's processing more of that information, the color, that it's moving fast, that it looks mean, that it has a collar. So those are all being processed too at the same time, and then it might come to your conscious awareness. So these aren't like completely exclusive. You can move things from the subconscious into conscious awareness. So Freud thought the subconscious was very, very important for a lot of things. But in a lot of ways, he was wrong about the things that the unconscious was important for. And when we get to talking about personality theories, we'll break down his id, ego, and superego and how he thought it related to how people behaved. For now, just know he thought a lot of what we did was actually because of unconscious motivations that drove us to do certain behaviors. But with that, there are a lot of mental processes that are outside of our conscious awareness. So a lot of our thoughts, a lot of our emotions, a lot of our goals and perceptions can be out there outside of our conscious awareness. And when we look at brain scans, we can see that those same areas that people are thinking about their goals actively, they're sometimes still active when doing some related task or even a slightly unrelated task. So their goals are still kind of there being processed neurologically. Like those neural networks are still like activating that same area that's activated when they think about their goals. So that can still be a subconscious kind of motivator. And then that kind of unconscious motivation can become conscious. Depending on which of the neural networks we hit, if we try to call that up and say, hey, I want to think about this goal. So it's interesting that we can be motivated in some ways by our unconscious thoughts and processes, but not in the same way that Freud thought. Sleep and dreams. So the natural state of rest for the body is, with that loss of consciousness that's recoverable, is called sleep. And you've probably heard of circadian rhythms. Essentially, it's your body's daily, or it should be daily, sleep and wake cycle. It also includes your body temperature, blood pressure levels, hormone levels. They all follow this kind of rhythm day by day. So with that, they're run by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which uses light input, which is essentially just an area in your brain that when it gets specific light input from, say, the sun rising or lights in your room, it helps synchronize your body with the time of day. So it actually can be a problem for fully blind people to have the same kind of schedule as people who are sighted. So with that, has anybody ever had jet lag in the class and tried any tricks to get rid of jet lag? So anyone that's tried tricks to get rid of jet lag that worked or didn't work, let me know. Looks like we've got some chats. All right, so Parker, you didn't try any tricks, but you did have bad jet lag. And Des, you have a trick that worked. Would you mind in the chat, because I think your microphone wasn't working great earlier. What worked for you, Des? And then Adderall worked. Yeah, that might even put you in an altered state of consciousness. Yeah, either way, Jess, if you want to use your mic or the chat, go for it. As you're doing that, either finding your mic or putting it in the chat, I'll give one example from someone that I know. I work with a colleague who lives in Australia, and he used to live in the US in Michigan. So he very often flies back and forth. And so that is essentially the whole way around the world to get to Australia versus Michigan. So the trick that he swears by is that he does not eat anything on the plane. He doesn't eat any of the snacks. He doesn't eat any kind of food at all. He'll drink water, and that is all. So he has like no calorie intake the entire flight. And he swears that he does not have jet lag. And he travels far more often than me. I haven't tried it yet, mostly because I get too hungry and I get bored and then I want a snack. So I don't know that I have the willpower to try that one. We've got another one, trying to stay awake until it gets dark, and that usually works for you. Yeah, that's actually a really good one, especially considering what we just talked about, how the suprachiasmatic nucleus uses the light to synchronize with our body. So that is actually one of the recommendations of experts, is when you get to your location, try to stay awake until it does get dark, and then go to sleep. And then you'll have less jet lag, even if that first day you're a little worse. So whenever you're ready, Des, you can start talking with your mic or put it in the chat. So Parker, the more you've flown, it's gotten better, so you don't get as much jet lag now since you've flown more and more. Yeah, I wonder if there's specific patterns or maybe neural networks that you've trained for that. All right, so Des says a 17-hour flight to Seoul was the worst. Someone gave you the tip of rubbing the knuckles closest to the palm on the middle and pointer fingers of both my hands and tugging on them to help. And it worked. Interesting. So rubbing the pads of your hands. So maybe I'll have to read that one over again and try that one sometimes. That sounds very interesting. First ever flight from Salt Lake City to Moscow, Russia. That is a long flight. Like a massage for the fingers and the palm. And you think it was placebo effect? Interesting. So I think that trying that was a placebo effect. Maybe got you to focus on something during the flight. Interesting. Yeah, thanks for everyone's participation. I'm glad we heard a variety of tips that people have heard. Yeah, a couple hour flight. I'm assuming the flight to LA was from Salt Lake City. Yeah, that's just a couple hours. So hopefully you wouldn't have too bad of jet lag for that. Yeah. All right. So the recommendations from experts are some of the things that we've talked about already. One, arriving at the destination during the day is very helpful. So it's already bright when you arrive. Spending time outside in the daylight. So we didn't talk about this one specifically, but if you're actually out in sunlight, it's going to be better than even if it's during the day with office lights or like interior lighting. You'll be better. Then melatonin supplements at night, and then going to sleep at night will help as well. So as an example, I took a flight to Spain, a red-eye flight, because it was the cheapest one. But I arrived at 6:30 in the morning, so the sun was just coming up. So I knew these tips, and I mean, I was in Spain. I was a little excited to see things, so I stayed awake. I wasn't able to sleep much on the plane, so I stayed awake that whole day essentially, and then went to sleep at night. And that whole trip, I didn't have jet lag, which was nice. That first day was a little tough, the whole day, because I hadn't had very much sleep, but I didn't get any jet lag after that because of these things, because it was during the day, spent time outside. I didn't take melatonin supplements, but yeah, waiting until the nighttime at the new place will definitely help, especially if you're getting actual daylight. All right, so let's talk a little bit about why we sleep. So with this, there's not too much evidence on why we sleep. Most of it is hypotheses about why we sleep. So one idea is that evolutionarily, it might have kept humans from becoming prey or injuring ourselves at night. So even our pre-human ancestors might have had times of rest during the night so they didn't go wander and fall off a cliff or get eaten by saber-toothed tigers or something like that. So keeping us from becoming prey or injuring ourselves might be one reason that humans as mammals evolved sleep. It might also help to conserve energy. If you can shut down the machine that is your body for a couple hours, you don't have to intake as many calories. It might be also safer to forage for that food in the daylight, easier. I mean, I kind of wish we had evolved better night vision so we could forage for food in the nighttime, but then we'd probably be very different. I don't think we could change just that one thing. I think our behavior would be largely different. One other hypothesis is that sleep might be a restorative process that restores, replenishes, and rebuilds the brain and body. So one piece of evidence we do have for this one is that more proteins, which are those things that then read the genes and manage cells, they are more active during sleep. So it seems like that helps with things like memory storage and retrieval and encoding. That helps with healing, for example. So sleep can literally help you get better quicker for a lot of things. So a lot of the activity that proteins do is more active at night. So it seems to be very useful for your body in that way. It might support brain plasticity as well, which is something that we covered with neurology. Brain plasticity is very important. We have the capacity to change different areas of our brain, to focus on new tasks, to do new things, make new connections between neurons, and those connections between neurons seem to get stronger during sleep. So that might help with memory consolidation. It's not working, your brain while you're sleeping is not working on processing new conscious information. So right now I'm processing seeing the things on my desk, seeing the colors, thinking about my plan of what I need to do after the meeting is over. So I'm conscious of all these things. So my brain is doing those processes. So when I'm asleep, it doesn't have to do those processes. It's not processing new visual information, maybe a little bit of auditory information. So it can focus on the tasks of consolidating memories, running through those neural network habits that we've created and making those stronger so they happen quicker the next time. So good question about dreams. We're actually going to get to that in just a couple slides. Maybe we should talk. Just trying to decide if let's talk about dreams now. Then we can talk about stages of sleep. Okay. So we'll go back and talk about different stages of dreams. So we've kind of skipped over that. So some of the comments here in the slides might not be super relevant, but it is something that students are often interested in, our dreams and why we dream and what they are for, essentially. So let's talk about it. So with dreams, a lot of recent research shows that dreams are most often very similar to day-to-day life, and most dreams are not exceptionally strange. What that means is most dreams are not going to be like this top picture here of us flying an airplane or a blimp with the whale being the blimp. Most dreams are probably going to be set in a setting like your home or your work or your school, like places that you're usually at, and have like slight differences or changes, but they're often very similar to day-to-day life. With that being said, obviously we can and do dream in some fantastical ways. So like these images, you might have had dreams similar to them. Yeah, with that, most dreams though are pretty similar to day-to-day life. Any ideas why that might be, knowing some of the topics about neurology we've come back to a few times today? Well, think about that as we continue on. Oh, so I think it's because it connects images and brain processes in the subconscious. Yeah, essentially that's what it is. Your brain, a lot of dreams, not all, but a lot of your dreams, a lot of that experience of dreaming seems to be these brain processes that are running while you're asleep, while you're not conscious of them. Those brain processes running, and because of that, you have these images that are similar to what you've experienced in day-to-day life. Maybe you're consolidating memories from that day, those kinds of things. So that is kind of the raw data that your brain is working with at that time, and it's kind of then interpreted by your brain in a way that you can kind of consciously be aware of in dreams. So good. With that, there isn't any evidence of dreams providing wisdom or problem-solving opportunities. So you might have heard someone say, oh, I always write down like the thing I'm most worried about, like in a journal on my nightstand or something like that. And sometimes I dream about an answer. That could definitely happen, but it's probably more because of them working through that problem and being worried about that. If you just put some random thing that you weren't thinking about during the day, you probably won't have a dream about it. So why do we dream? Well, one of those, let's talk about the two basic ideas. One is the cognitive theory of dreaming, and this is basically what we've been talking about, that dreaming involves information that's being processed by our memories using those same neurological processes, those same neural networks. So let's say you're running through the same 5,000 neurons that are related to a memory that you're processing from the day, as well as driving. Well, then you might at the same time have a dream about driving. May also come from that default mode network activity, those processes that are just always running. And there's also the activation synthesis theory. So this thing says that dreams might happen when cerebral cortex synthesizes neural signals from the lower part of the brain. So it might sound pretty similar. This one, the cognitive theory of dreaming, is that you're processing specific things at the time, memories, running through the default mode, and from that activity, you then kind of interpret it or have a dream about those materials, that memory, that kind of thing. Activation synthesis is that any random kind of spark that your brain is working with might trigger a whole new network, and that's a dream. And so this one might be where you get more crazy dreams, like a whale blimp, right? So those, or maybe you're also getting a external stimulus, like a sound in your room, and that is then processed as well with things in your brain. So you're getting an activation from something, an activation that's then synthesized within the things your brain is already doing. With that, there is evidence for both of these, and it's also interesting that damage to your brainstem doesn't stop dreaming. So you can still have dreams even if you're not getting direct signals from outside. A really good example of this is one time I was having a dream that I was in the park of Jurassic Park. Usually not a great place to be by the end of those movies, right? So at the that's a good question about dreaming in comas. So Christopher asks, so you can dream in comas? I believe so, but I do feel like I need to check that. I can probably just check that really. One thing that's hard with that is There are reports of people coming out of comas that say they did dream or they did hear things during the coma, and there are people who say that they didn't. So it's really not clear to scientists whether the people were actually experiencing things. Brain activity wise, they could, depending on the type of coma, they could possibly have dreams. I don't know how often it is or if they remember them after the coma. That's a good question, though. Actually, right now, maybe I won't look it up in the midst of class, but I'll write it down. Or you could, I mean, I will check it, but also a good thing for a question paper, possibly, if that's something that's of interest to you. Find a research paper or two about that. So where was I? My dream that I was in Jurassic Park. So during the dream, I was in the park. It started out really nice, seeing dinosaurs, ooh, ah, all those kinds of things. But then people started getting eaten by dinosaurs because that's what happens in those movies. And at the very end of the dream, a park alarm started going off. So there's this loud alarm all throughout, and people in my dream were saying, like, let's turn the alarm off. Like, it's confusing. Like, I can't get my work done. I need to do this over here. So with that, it turns out that park alarm was actually my alarm clock, alarming to wake me up. And it had been ringing for about like 6 minutes from the time before I actually turned it off. So that external stimuli activated something within the dream I was having. That sound of my alarm became part of the dream that I was already in the midst of having. So some evidence there for the activation synthesis theory. That's happened to me specifically. You might have had that too, like someone's trying to wake you up becomes part of your dream. So yeah, the dreams, we've got that activation synthesis theory as well as the cognitive theory of dreaming. Each of them are a lot about like how your brain processes information neurologically, how the neurons work. So cognitive theory, more about the default mode network, processing things, just your brain's natural processes are becoming a dream, versus activation synthesis. Those natural processes are also primed by outside inputs. So that's an interesting question, that you can't dream of faces you haven't already seen. I would imagine you could like potentially dream of a face and then possibly meet a person with that face, but because it's a dream, you probably wouldn't recognize it, because a lot of those things within our dreams are kind of combining the processes that we're working on. So you might dream of someone who has, say, blonde hair and brown eyes or something like that, and then meet someone who looks kind of similar to that like 2 years later, just out of happenstance, right? There's billions of people in the world. Yeah. Deja vu is another interesting one that I think we do get to in this one. Let me see if I can skip forward to deja vu. Maybe I took it out. Yep, I must have taken it out. So deja vu is kind of similar in some ways to dreaming. So let's go back to these theories of dreaming. So deja vu, the explanations that we have seem to be that it is because of that we feel like something has happened before, because other very similar things have happened. The way we process information and process memories specifically is by pulling up whole sections of memory that aren't, well, I guess it might be easier to describe how memory works first. Well, kind of a brief overview. There's a whole chapter on it. We're going to get to it in a few weeks. So memories essentially they're not a video record of exactly what has happened to us. So your memory is not a direct document that's like stored in your brain, a video file with your emotions attached to it and things, and like stored to a specific place. You don't pull up that specific memory. When you think of learning to drive a car, a lot of that memory is probably, for example, I learned to drive a car, it was probably the course of 2 weeks. I had like a week where my father was trying to teach me and then a week of like a formal class. So with that, I only remember like 2 days of that. But within those 2 days that I remember, everything's kind of jumbled up in there, right? So I remember being in the car with the other students who were taking it with me. I remember the instructor. I remember doing a couple exercises. I remember some of the other students doing some of those exercises, but I couldn't put in detail like exactly what happened when. And that's because our memories kind of cluster themselves onto other similar memories. So those memories all kind of clustered together as one group. Um, so I don't actually remember that. Like if I tried to recall learning to drive, I would not be able to say like in a court of law, like I know for sure this definitely happened on this day, this day, this day. We can have memories that are that clear that we know, hey, on this exact day, like this exact thing happened at this exact time. Um, those are generally processed a little different. For most of our memories, they're kind of a amalgamation of a lot of memories. So learning to play guitar, I've got a lot of similar memories that are kind of like mushed up together is one way you could think of it. You probably have a lot of mushed up memories of hanging out with friends in high school, for example. Like you might not be able to pick out a couple, like any given specific day, but you might be able to remember one specific experience or a couple specific experiences, but not all the specific experiences. Are kind of jumbled up. So with that, deja vu is kind of that recall happening, pulling back from that kind of jumble of memory and assembling it and us feeling like we have experienced this same exact thing because we've experienced enough things similar to it that our brain can pull up with memory that exact pattern of what happened. So I'm thinking of The Matrix where Neo sees like the cat like a second time. Well, with that, I've seen cats on my street out here. So I might have deja vu, for example, that, oh, I've seen that exact cat run that exact way in the past. When in reality, this is a new thing that's happening, but it's similar enough to the memories that I have that my brain recognizes it. It's like, oh, this has happened before because that's how it feels with the memories. And then probably this new experience will be kind of clustered with all that group of memories. So that was an attempt at explaining how memory works before you've actually read the chapter that I hope was helpful. Essentially, with that, a memory itself is not stored in an individual neuron. Usually memories involve a whole network of neurons. So networks that remember aspects of faces, networks that are involved in feeling of emotion. So anytime you remember something, you actually in some way re-experience that event. You can also change memories slightly in that way. So if you remember back to your first kiss, if it was 30 years ago, you've probably changed that memory slightly based on other experiences since then. If your first kiss was just like a week ago, it's probably pretty similar to the actual event. But we alter memories slightly as we remember them because it's involved in our current feelings. So as an example, the first kiss example. So you might remember your first kiss. It might have been a really positive experience, but when you're remembering it right now, it might be right after a bad breakup. And so that negative emotion that you have currently might kind of, bad word for it, but like imprint onto that earlier memory so that your new memory of your first kiss now has a little bit of that like negativity of this breakup that you've just been through. So the next time you try to remember that, it's a little different than it was before because it's essentially just neural networks that are activating in specific sequences. So deja vu is we are having an experience that is very similar to a lot of other experiences that we've had. If it's a very different deja vu, like something that is completely out of the norm for something that's happened to you, there's not really any explanation for those. But generally, that's how deja vu is explained, that it's essentially us experiencing something similar enough that we can pull from our memory and be like, hey, this exact thing has happened before. or I've dreamed this specific thing. And it is even possible that we have dreamed that specific thing. It's really not clear how many dreams we have, how detailed they are, how they're tied to memories as well. So that was a really long answer for that, but I did feel like I had to get some of that basics of memory. Hopefully that was interesting and useful to you, though. All right, so let's jump back to, we've gone over that picture of the kid screaming in the bed a few times. We should probably get to sleep disorders. All right, let's talk about stages of sleep and then some sleep disorders. So stage N1 is a non-REM sleep, and this is a drowsy sleep. You often have muscle jerks or spasms, feelings of falling. So if you've ever been starting to fall asleep and you feel like you're falling and you kind of like jerk in your bed to like stop yourself from falling, you're in stage N1 sleep. As a professor who's taught in-person classes, I've seen a lot of students in N1 sleep, which maybe doesn't say a lot about my skill as a professor. But I have seen students in stage N1 sleep where they're drowsy. Like if you look at them, you wouldn't necessarily say they're asleep, but you might say they're falling asleep, right? And sometimes you'll see a student like with their hand on their desk, and then after a time they'll go like that. Stage N1 sleep. We've got another question from Don. There's no scientific reliable evidence. That doesn't mean that it's not possible in some way, but Don, it doesn't seem like we can have an actual dream about the future. It's most of what science says is that feeling that you have seen this exact thing or this exact moment is probably that combination of previous memories that you're now bringing forward or putting together those past memories in that specific way. So stage N1 sleep, yep, that's that first stage of sleep. With that, you probably, if you were woken up from stage N1 sleep, you probably wouldn't even say you were asleep. You might say, oh, I'm just tired. But if you look at the brain waves of someone, you would be able to see that they are actually asleep. Stage N2 is also a non-REM sleep. It is deeper than N1, but it is still pretty light. So you do have decreased muscle activity, but you still might be woken up from this and say that you weren't sleeping. So someone who has now fallen asleep in class might be in stage N2 sleep. And if you kind of move their chair, they'll be like, oh, I wasn't sleeping. They're probably in N2 sleep. So N3 is also a non-REM sleep. It's actually the deepest sleep. The brain waves or the electrical activity are the most different from our waking brain. So here we've got waking waves, alpha and beta waves. Stage N1, you can see that's still pretty similar to these our waking brain waves here. And stage N2 is a little bit more different. Stage N3 is quite a bit different than what we experience during wakefulness. And then REM sleep is actually very similar to what we experience for wakefulness. So sleepwalking, sleep talking, bedwetting, all of those are most likely to happen during stage N3 sleep. Also, we tend to wake up confused and disoriented from N3 sleep. So if you've ever tried to take a 20-minute nap and woke up and been like, oh my goodness, what year is it? Still 2020, unfortunately. No, but if you've experienced that, you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, what day is it? What time is it? Have I slept for 3 years? You were probably in N3 sleep. So with that, if you've ever, I totally forgot to grab it, like a graph from a Fitbit. It will tell you deep sleep. Deep sleep on like a Fitbit tracker is stage N3 sleep. So usually we enter N3 sleep pretty close to the beginning of the night, and then we have that deep sleep less and less throughout the night. REM sleep is one that you've probably heard of, rapid eye movement sleep. And usually you go through stage 1, 2, and 3, and then back up into REM instead of waking. So 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, REM is usually what happens. So I think I said that wrong the first time. So we go generally as we're sleeping, stage N1, stage N2, stage N3, which is the deepest. Then we go back up to stage N2, stage N1, but then instead of waking up, we go into REM sleep. So it is the most active stage of sleep. So as you can see, the brain waves are pretty similar to our wakeful waves. This is usually when we remember the most dreams, and the brain activity is most similar to our wakeful activity. So each sleep cycle lasts about 90 to 100 minutes and reoccurs a couple times during the night. So right when you go to sleep, you will tend to jump quickly down into deep sleep. And then as the night goes on, you'll be less and less in deep sleep. And you'll see here some periods of REM sleep. You might wake up a couple times. So this is actually really similar to a graph that, say, a Fitbit would spit out to you. Yep. So the average, so you can actually check this on your trackers for sleep. You should average about 60% light sleep, about 20% deep sleep, and about 20% REM sleep. So if you're not getting as much REM or especially as much deep sleep, you might not feel as rested. So, but generally a lot of our sleep is that lighter sleep. All right, so let's talk about some sleep disorders: insomnia, sleepwalking, nightmares, night terrors, narcolepsy, and sleep apnea. All right, so insomnia is the inability to sleep. So this is not just difficulty falling asleep. It can be waking a lot of times during the night, waking up too early by yourself, not like because your 3-year-old is jumping on the room above you, but he might have insomnia. Sleeping pills can help short term, but long term, the thing that helps most for insomnia is establishing consistent sleep schedules, sometimes making more consistent diet, those kinds of things. Sleepwalking and sleep talking tend to happen during N3 sleep. With that, if you remember N3 sleep, it is here, it's the deepest sleep. Our brain waves are very different from waking. You wake up very confused and disoriented. So the person sleepwalking generally doesn't have any idea that they're doing that. They have no conscious awareness of that. Their body is just doing things. So it is best to wake sleepwalkers up. They generally, because they're in N3 sleep, they're going to be disoriented, confused, maybe even angry. It does seem to happen more when you're sleep deprived or using alcohol. Sleep talking can sometimes seem coherent even though they're in N3 sleep, but they're not conscious. So one funny experience I had was one night early in the evening, so 1 o'clock or so when I was in high school, my brother, who sleptwalked, came into my room, sat on the foot of my bed, and had a conversation with me about something. Things that he was worried about in school, things like that. Probably lasted 15 minutes, and then he got back up and walked to his room. Come to find out the next day, like I asked him about it, like I asked him a follow-up question. He didn't remember at all. He had sleptwalked to my room. He had had an entire conversation, but he wasn't actually conscious at all. So sleep talking, it is tied to the subconscious, not in the Freudian sense. It is tied to the subconscious. Sleep talking is tied to the subconscious in the fact that you have processes. Talking for humans is a really habitual process. Like we talk a lot, we communicate a lot, we listen, we respond. So our neurons are really good at doing that. So subconsciously, yeah, we can actually run and have run those processes and have full conversations with people when we're not aware of it at all, when we're sleep talking. So it is tied to the subconscious in the sense that, yes, this is a process that your brain can just run by itself, that you might not be consciously aware of. It's not subconscious in the sense like Freudian subconscious. So people say it's or think it might be dangerous to wake sleepwalkers because they can get a little bit erratic right at first, but that is better than the alternative that they go and say hurt themselves. So it could be dangerous, like they might like flail around or be really confused and really upset for a minute, but it is better than, say, a sleepwalker walking out or even running out in jogging shoes and getting hit by a car, which has happened as well. So let's answer to that, Destiny. Oh, sorry, Des, I think I just made a thumbs up on your question instead of reading it. So Des specifically has had experiences with sleep talking and walking, yeah. Yeah, a lot of people who sleep talk might just say complete nonsense. Some people might be completely coherent. It really just depends on those processes that their brains are running. That experience with my brother having a full conversation, that only happened 2 or 3 times. Usually if it was sleep talking, it was something like I was camping in a tent near him and he like said a sentence or said a couple words together. That was generally his sleep talking. I had another roommate one time that would say kind of repetitive phrases. So he would say some of the same phrases every time he slept talked. So yeah, it's essentially just the brain's process those habitual processes. So if your friend is laughing in their sleep, maybe they laugh a lot during the day, or something is triggering that in their neural processes. It's kind of funny how a lot of these kind of bizarre behaviors, or even to outside observers, funny or strange conversations or things like that, are really caused by our basic brain chemistry of neurons talking to other neurons and processing memories and processing the default things that they usually do. That is, so Lindsay asks if they're usually dreaming while sleepwalking or talking. It doesn't seem so, but it is also difficult to remember dreams from N3 sleep. So it is clear you can dream in N3 sleep, but because people wake up really disoriented from it, it is hard for them to report dreams or if they are dreaming about something. So that's one of those problems. Like, it could be that they are talking specifically about the dream they're having, you know, but it's really a hard thing to research. If you're asking someone that is being woken up from N3 sleep that was sleep talking, they're going to be disoriented. It's going to be really hard to ask them that and get a good answer. So, yeah. They can track brain waves, so they can see what stage of sleep a person's in. They can then wake them up. But even though they're in N3 sleep, they're waking them up, the person's going to feel really disoriented. So they might not be able to remember that they're in, say, a sleep study, or really respond to the researcher for a couple moments. And by that time, they might not remember any dreams. That's one reason why it seems like REM is the time we most often dream, because when researchers wake people up from REM, they more often report dreams. And that just might be a function of the neurology that they're aware of and consciously aware of that dream at that time. But yeah, you can track the brain waves and wake people up at different stages of sleep. People tend to dream more than they remember, but some people dream very little and some people dream a lot. I thought it was in here actually, but I didn't see it as I was scrolling through. But most people have in between like would report in between 3 to 7 dreams a week if they're woken up and then asked about it. So if you dream more than that, well, then you're dreaming a little more than about average. If you dream less than that and can report less than that, then that's fine too. But most people do dream fairly frequently, almost once a night, like a little less than once a night on average. So, but even with that, we don't necessarily always remember those the next morning. We might wake up at 2 a.m. and be able to report a dream at that time to, say, a researcher, but by the time we wake up at 6 a.m., we might not remember that anymore. So, good question. All right, so let's talk about, Sleepwalking Elite is a really good song by Chevelle. I always like to bring it up because talking about sleepwalking makes me think of the song. It's got nothing to do with sleepwalking, but it's a really good song. So if you're interested, It's Chevelle's a hard rock band. Good stuff. So nightmares and night terrors. So nightmares are a specific kind of dream that is scary. So a dream of, say, a clown or a spider or something like that, like something that is scary to you that you're dreaming about. So usually people are waking up from REM sleep with a nightmare with that scary dream. It's usually some danger. They peak around age 3 to 6, so I should include that in the slide. But age 3 to 6 is about when nightmares peak, and then they decline. Like, we can obviously still have nightmares all throughout life, but they are most common in between about 3 to 6 and decline after that. It is correlated with life stressors, so if you're more stressed or more anxious, you will be more likely to have a nightmare. Nightmares are very different from night terrors. Yeah, this is here. So Professor Rich's recurring nightmare as a child was actually of E.T., the extraterrestrial. So I wasn't actually scared of the movie E.T., but I had a reoccurring nightmare about the time I was 5, that a piggy bank on my dresser. I didn't have an ET piggy bank. I had it was shaped like a pig. It was an actual piggy bank. But in my dream, it was ET. It would grow, turn to life, and chase me around my house. Like, it would be floating, chasing me around my house. And I had to like fly through my house, or sometimes I couldn't fly. Sometimes I was just running. Sometimes like doors would get stuck and I couldn't open the door. And then when it caught me, I would wake up and I'd be terrified. I don't know, I just got eaten by ET or something. But some of the times I could make it back to my bed and hide under my covers, and then I was safe in the dream. And then I would wake up from it a little less scared than when it ate me or whatever. So that was my reoccurring nightmare. So yep, it did peak around that time in my life and declined. I even had actually that specific dream like 2 years ago or so. Like, pretty recently, I actually had that specific dream again. So neurology, crazy things. So nightmares, though, are very different. Oh, that's a good question. So why do we have reoccurring dreams? So it's kind of the same answer as a lot of these things, because a lot of the processes that our brain does when sleeping are similar. So we're processing memories, we're processing, we have similar sounds going on in our room. So there's similar kinds of inputs. Whether it's a cat scratches at your door every night, you have a pet bird or a pet gerbil that makes noise every night. Yeah, reoccurring nightmares can be slightly different each time. But a lot of times our dreams are very similar because it's the same neural processes that have activated the dream. And you'll find that tends to be around the same time of night that those dreams happen too. So for example, my dreams of ET would actually happen around, like, I'd wake up about 3:30 in the morning. Yes, sleep paralysis is considered a sleep disorder. And so let's talk about night terrors, and then we're going to get to sleep paralysis in just a minute. So a night terror is very different than a nightmare, and I'm glad for all the questions, for sure. We'll definitely not get through talking about drugs tonight for this class. We'll talk about that briefly the next time we meet. But hopefully we can get through all these sleep disorders in the next couple minutes. So night terrors are very different from a nightmare. It's a sudden arousal from sleep and having a really intense fear. So usually people who wake up from and have a night terror, they have rapid heart rate, rapid breathing, they might be screaming, they might be sweating. It peaks in between the ages of 5 and 7, and it tends to occur during slow wave non-REM sleep. So like N1, N2, N3. So N3 is the most common, and it's not, or it doesn't seem to be, tied to nightmares themselves. It seems to be just random, totally random, that there's sudden triggers neurologically that make you wake up in a really stressed state, a really fearful state. So it can be caused by underlying conditions. So whether it's a physical or mental condition, so illness, infection, sleep apnea can also cause night terrors, and mental health condition can also cause night terrors. An example of that, I forget what the infection was. My daughter, a few years ago, she was having really frequent, I remember what it was. She was having memories. That's how they work. I was trying to remember it. I started talking about the story, and then the part I couldn't remember, just recall, was then activated by the other neurons in that network. So my daughter was having night terrors for like about 2 months or so, and they were pretty bad. She would wake up not quite every night, but around the same time, like every other or every third night, just screaming and unconsolable. She wasn't aware that we were there, trying to like hug her, say, hey, it's okay. We tried to wake her up. It wouldn't work. And so we ended up going to her pediatrician, just like for a normal appointment. And I mentioned it. I was like, yeah, she's having night terrors. I'm not sure what to do. And the pediatrician's like, hey, let's give her a blood test. I was like, okay, you're the doctor, we'll do that. And come to find out, she actually had a urinary tract infection that no one was aware of. And she got on some amoxicillin, and like 2 weeks later, no more night terrors. So because of that urinary tract infection, it actually caused and triggered these night terrors at about the same time every night. So lots of things can cause them. Stress reduction can help them become less common. Also, if you know someone has that pattern to have a night terror at the same time, like if it's almost always at like 12:15 right after midnight, wake them up right at midnight. They'll fall back asleep, their sleep cycle will restart, and they probably won't then have the night terror. So if you wake them up about 15 minutes before they would have. So I think a useful thing that I would have liked to know when she was having those night terrors. Another sleep disorder is narcolepsy. This is a sudden overpowering urge to sleep, just essentially falling asleep. People with narcolepsy might even fall asleep standing up, when they're in the midst of talking, when they're driving a car, and they usually jump straight into REM sleep, which is very different than our normal sleep. Usually go N1, N2, N3, N2, N1 REM. For narcolepsy, you jump straight into REM. So it can be really dangerous, obviously, if you're falling asleep as you're driving. It can be problematic if you're falling asleep at work like this. It can be an extreme emotional reaction. So you can trigger a narcoleptic episode, and it looks like someone just passes out. They might have literally fallen into REM sleep. Surprise, anger, excitement. If you have narcolepsy, those things can trigger it as well. So having a surprise party for someone who has narcolepsy might not be the best idea. And generally it's caused by problems in the amygdala and hypothalamus. So because of the triggering of specific emotions, it kind of triggers jumping into REM sleep rather than other reactions to it. Sleep paralysis is another sleep disorder. Sleep paralysis is that feeling of being conscious but unable to move. So you feel like you are consciously awake, but that your body is stiff, that you're stuck. People will describe them feeling like there's a weight on their chest. They can't speak. They might even feel like they're a choking feeling. Some people describe it as even feeling like it's an evil presence. That's why you'll find artwork like this. It might be scary right now, especially this late at night. Hopefully you have some lights on in your house. I don't mean to have like a horror class right before people go to sleep. But there is a lot of artwork you'll find like this, where there's little demons sitting on people's chests. Oh yeah, sleep paralysis. Yes, the experience of sleep paralysis, I've only experienced it a handful of times, but I can remember those times because it's a very terrifying experience as you're experiencing it. It feels like there might be things around you or something on your chest. You can't really talk, you can't move. So why does it happen? What is actually happening that causes sleep paralysis? Well, think about N3 sleep. It's essentially always happening in N3 sleep. Our brain signals are very different, you see here, than wakeful sleep. And then we jump up to wakefulness, and that is what happens. So you're essentially in N3 sleep, you wake up, and so you are awake. It's an unusual wake up, essentially. So your body is still kind of saying to your body, so your brain in some ways is still saying to your body, hey, you're still in N3 sleep. When you're in N3 sleep, you don't generally move very much. So you're still getting signals from your brain saying, hey, be relaxed, don't send muscle signals, like we're just running through processes, don't actually move the arms while we're talking about arm movement, like talking to the arm movement neurons. So your brain's kind of not caught up with your conscious awareness. You are starting to wake up, you are now awake, but your body is still getting sleep signals saying, hey, don't actually move. And that's why it feels like you can't breathe. You're not going to actually choke to death from sleep paralysis. You won't be able to move for just a little bit. So it'll take a minute for your arms to start actually being able to move. And that can be really scary. Like the experience of having that happen can be really scary. But all it is essentially you're now consciously awake, but your body has to kind of catch up to that. And like it makes it sound really simple and easy to explain. And it is that simple and easy to explain. But the experience of it, yes, is very scary by itself. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. I mean, it's not technically accurate that we're not acting out our dreams. So Destiny says that a teacher said it prevents us from acting out our dreams. So kind of, because your brain is processing a lot of things, and you might be dreaming about things like doing parkour, your body, while it's running through all these processes, whether it's connecting with movement areas of your brain, thinking areas, singing areas, it wants to actually rest. It knows this is sleep time. I'm just running through these. So yeah, it's kind of like disconnecting from actually having your body do those things. So a good way to say it does prevent us from acting out our dreams. And so if sleep paralysis is happening to you really frequently, it's definitely something that can be treated. So talk to a doctor about any of these sleep conditions. Other sleep disorders can trigger sleep paralysis, stress, mental disorders. Some medicines can cause it to happen. Lack of sleep can cause it to happen as well. So if it's disturbing you in your life, if it's happening more than you want it to, talk to a doctor about it for sure, for any of these really. Since for me, sleep paralysis has probably only happened to me like 5 times in my life. It's not really been that, like the experience is not fun, but it isn't really impacting my life that badly. But if it is for you, definitely talk about it. Especially sleep apnea is the last sleep disorder I think we'll have time for. Essentially, the sleeper stops breathing during sleep. So with that, the windpipe fails to open, or the brain processes sending messages to breathe fail. So the brain just doesn't send that message. And so whether it's the windpipe closing itself or whether it's the brain saying, hey, breathe, stops, either way, the person stops breathing. So there are a lot of people who have sleep apnea because of that. They're choking to death in their sleep, so they will have brief awakenings, a lot of brief awakenings during the night. If you look at their Fitbit tracker, for example, or any sleep tracker, you'll see lots of short waking periods during the night. So just a lot of times waking up. People who have sleep apnea feel very groggy because they're waking up so much. It's hard to get into N3 sleep, like they might get to N1, N2, but never get to N3. They might never get to that deep sleep. It's often accompanied by snoring and then not breathing. Yes, people can die from sleep apnea, so it is definitely something to get treated. If someone snores a lot, so let's say you're sleeping next to a roommate or a partner or a child or something like that, and they're snoring really loudly, and then it seems like they aren't breathing for like 20 seconds to 60 seconds, and then all of a sudden they kind of gasp and then start snoring again. It's pretty likely that they have sleep apnea and should get treated. There are good treatments that can prevent it from happening. One is a CPAP machine like this that essentially puts a seal on the airwaves that keep the pressure open so the airway cannot close. That doesn't necessarily help with the one where it's the brain not sending the signal to breathe, but it helps with most cases of sleep apnea. So with that, you can help it. It can get better with weight loss. Side sleeping, it makes it less likely that the windpipe will close. Elevating the head higher will make it less likely. and a CPAP machine is very, very helpful. So definitely something to get treated if you have sleep apnea or you think you know someone who does. If someone snores a lot and then seems to not be breathing for a little bit and then either gasps or goes back to loud snoring again, they might have sleep apnea. They'll often feel tired. If they have something like a sleep tracker, you might see that they don't really get into deep sleep and they have a lot of wakeful periods, like really short wakeful periods, because they're waking up because they're not breathing. So yeah, it's definitely a dangerous one to get treated. And any disorder with sleep can be dangerous because obviously sleep does seem to help us recharge and process things in our body and our brain. So you probably have experienced yourself. If you don't sleep well, you don't perform as well in a lot of things. Oh, interesting. So neurodivergent patients having, and also trauma leading to more sleep apnea. I hadn't heard that specifically, but that's really interesting. Maybe Des, you should do a question paper about that. Because there are a lot of different sleep disorders that are more common in people with a variety of disorders or different neurodivergent brain patterns. So I would not be surprised, but I had not seen those specific studies. On your own, it is difficult to know for sure if you have it, but you can, say, talk to your doctor about that, and they can ask you questions more specific than I am right now to see if it's a pretty high likelihood. If they think it's a pretty high likelihood, they might then have you do a sleep study, like have your sleep monitored or give you a specific kind of tracker to see if you do have sleep apnea, because it is something that you should get checked out. But yeah, if you think you have it and there's not someone there to witness it, and that would be a hard thing. Hey, can you stay awake all night and see if I'm breathing at all minutes of the night? So that would be a hard thing to ask someone to do, right? But talk to a doctor about it. They can help ask you more specific questions and then get you monitoring devices or even get your sleep observed by researchers or other doctors as well. So yeah, good questions. I think that is the last sleep disorders. Sleep Apnea is also a really good song by Chevelle. It's actually one of my favorite ones, and that one is actually about sleep apnea. One of their friends suffered from sleep apnea, so the song's about that. So let's talk about other states of consciousness, altered states. Next time that we meet, it's now 9:51, so let's meet again next Tuesday. We will start off with talking about probably a little bit about PowerPoints, see if you've made your groups, and then finish up with Chapter 4 and then start with Chapter 8. So if you get finished with Chapter 4, get finished with the quiz on Chapter 4, the smart book on it, feel free to jump into Chapter 8 reading because it's a dense chapter. There's a lot there, and we don't have as much time as I would like to cover Chapter 8. So what would cause someone to wake up every night around a certain time? It could be the pattern of waking up at the same time every night could actually be a lot of these different sleep disorders. So sleep apnea, you would probably also be waking up other times, but not narcolepsy, but night terrors could cause that. Specific nightmares could cause that. Sleepwalking, any kind, insomnia. Insomnia is one thing I would say would definitely be likely to have you waking up at the same time consistently. And yeah, so thank you very much for sharing your experiences and talking today. I'm glad we had a lot of chat here. I hope the chat is saved. It looks like we've got a question from Alejandro. So go for it, and then I think I'm going to stop recording after this question. Yeah, I think the next time we talk about deja vu specifically is when we talk about memories. So if you wanted to do a paper on dreams or deja vu, since we've touched on that today, that could definitely be a topic for a question paper. So hopefully all of you have been finding some topics that are interesting, whether today or maybe when we talk about social psych or developmental hopefully you find topics that are interesting, and you can definitely do a question paper. Just remember, have one peer-reviewed article on it and any other good source. So yeah, really good question. All right, thanks for the good class. We definitely should let you go, but have a great night, and thank you very much for your participation today. I had a lot of fun talking about these topics. So have a good night now that we've talked about all this information about sleep. Hopefully you can get some good sleep.